Well, the U.S. Coast Guard now says it's reopening the Mississippi River to barge traffic. Now, remember, yesterday, over 700 barges were stranded and couldn't get through the biggest route for U.S. ag exports that goes down to the Gulf of Mexico. But what does this mean longer term? For more, Sterling Smith joins us now. He is the Director of Agricultural Research at Agri-Isampo North America. He's the guy that I turn to in these circumstances. Hey, Sterling, I wonder, how many of these issues are we going to have in the United States? And what does that mean then for things like corn exports and for the ag community?
Well, if we have more problems like this, clearly we need to export corn to make, to support our prices and support our farmers. And that's true for soybeans. Hopefully this appears to be just a one-off item, but it goes back to the subject of infrastructure. There's lock problems all the time on the Mississippi River. Things need to be dredged. These ports need to be improved. A lot of this infrastructure has been in place for a very long time. And this could be hard, not only for grain exports, but if you think about steel exports, moving items like coal, a lot of things go through the Mississippi River. It's basically the north-south superhighway.
In terms of how big a challenge that is, this feels, maybe this is just a one-off. But Sterling, we just had a pipeline problem. Now we've got a bridge problem. Like, I know it's not in the United States, but the other day we had a problem with the Suez Canal. These are, as you say, these are critical routes that are being disrupted. How big a challenge is it to get it so that this stuff works when we need it to?
It shouldn't be that big of a challenge. What we need is the effort to do it. And I think the people in Washington need to start answering to all of the people in the United States in basic governmental things. I'm not going to get political here because in my eyes, all politicians are equally useless. But this is a basic function of government. Well, it's bipartisan.
True. Okay, fair enough. Keep going.
But I do think basic things of government, providing infrastructure, is something they need to do before they do anything else. And that includes ports, roads, bridges, highways. It also includes our cyber infrastructure, which should be viewed just as a high-value target as any port or anything else.
Hey, Sterling, corn has had, and all the ags have had a really strong run. And then they kind of got hit a little bit with the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Report that we got earlier in the week, kind of more plantings than we might have thought for corn. And I'm wondering how you see the corn dynamic shaping up.
Well, I think we're looking at a potentially pretty solid market, at least through the fall. We have a burgeoning drought in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. We have a full-on drought in the Dakotas. Here in eastern Nebraska, things are pretty good, but we've been flirting with drought in the eastern Corn Belt. That's the first problem. The second problem is, while the report wasn't as bullish as people wanted, it was still a pretty bullish report. They increased soybean carryout a microscopic amount, and the corn just a little bit. More importantly, we've seen China in here, and they bought 6 million tons of corn for next year in the last 3 days. So clearly, the China corn deal is not going away anytime soon. China this year will import more corn from the United States than they have imported in the last 20 years combined. And that's because their hog business is changing and their needs for corn are going to change. So maintaining this infrastructure is good for farmers, and it's good for all the things else associated with agriculture up and down the river and stretching out into the heartland.
So this is a global market, though. Places like India are still suffering massively with COVID. It's still a story down in South America as well. How is that going to feed back into what is happening with ag demand?
Well, part of the issue with ag demand is Brazil had a short crop. They had drought problems. They did not produce as much as they thought they were going to produce. But if we don't get the COVID situation under control down there, it becomes a port problem, becomes a trucking problem. Moving grain is not nearly as efficient in Brazil as it is in the United States. Then the U.S. is going to become the bigger supplier. That's going to drive up U.S. prices and make this infrastructure situation even more important.
Yeah, let's also go back to what you were saying about hogs in China as well. Is that China's importing more corn than they ever have, and they're going to keep doing that. What about the Chinese economy when it comes to agriculture is changing? That's also then changing the supply and demand dynamics.
Oh, absolutely. We are seeing, we went through the ASF period, and that decimated the hog industry in China. Not unlike the price collapse we saw here in the late 90s. The China hog industry is moving to a professional industry, and they're going to be producing a lot more hogs. The price of pork eventually is going to go down in China because you're going to simply have more supply. But you also have a great deal of demand. Even though things have improved in China over the last 20 years, there's still plenty of people who are going to want to eat pork. And we're going from farms that raised a few hogs to these massive hog hotels that they call them, where you have thousands and thousands of hogs. You're going to have, a need for feed and everything else that goes along with that.
Yeah, they're trying to rebuild their herds, obviously, as it's been wiped out. So, and there's some of the imagery of these hog hotels, just to give you an idea of the kind of industrial scale that this whole process is being done on. This is a huge part of the food conversation in China, and as a result of which they're just massively ramping up infrastructure to get those herds back, and as you say, Sterling, to build them back. Can I just ask you a final question about what is going to happen globally with inflation? A lot of countries really rely on food. The food basket is a big part of how people spend their money, unlike in the United States and unlike in Europe. How do you see what you're seeing right now, kind of 6 months down the road, 12 months down the road? Because food prices are a pretty big predictor of geopolitical tension.
Absolutely. And the government's first thing they want to do is they want to keep people fed, especially in China, and do it economically. I see this inflation as transitory. We would have probably had this inflation without all of the monetary stimulus anyway, because it's more crop related and more product related, and to a certain degree, supply chain related. Those sorts of differences are different than the inflation that we saw in the 1970s, where it was a case of too many dollars chasing too few goods over a much more extended period of time. I do think this, for things like lumber, it's going to be transitory, because you will destroy demand for these items if you keep prices up for too long. But we could be looking at a period of elevated grain prices that could easily stretch 24 or 36 months, depending on the weather.